Okay, so welcome to today's lecture on the Nexus Seminar Series. Let's just give some time for everybody to arrive, and then we'll start in a minute or two. Asha, do you think we can start, or is everybody in who's registered?
There are more people who are supposed to be joining. Maybe they'll join in a minute or two.
Okay, I think we should start now. The others will join us as we continue. So welcome to all of you to today's Nexus Seminar, which is co-hosted by UNU-FLORES, that's the United Nations University Institute for Integrated Management of Material Fluxes and of Resources, and the Dresden Technical or University of Technology, TUD, in particular PRISMA, which is the Center for Sustainability Assessment and Policy. Prof. Samanthi Dijkstra-Silva is the Carlowitz Junior Professor for Sustainability Assessment and Policy. She usually represents TU Dresden and PRISMA, but she is on leave today. So today it's only me. My name is Serena Coetzee. I am from UNU-FLORES, and here I am responsible for everything related to education, which we present under the umbrella of the Knowledge Academy for the Resource Nexus, CARE. And I'm very happy to welcome all of you here today. Also with us today is Asha from UNU-FLORES, who will help us with technical support. Some background about the Nexus Seminar. The series was established in 2015. It features speakers, usually senior researchers, on the topics of sustainability and the resource nexus. That is the integrated management of environmental resources so that synergies and trade-offs can be identified and can be leveraged. Apart from the public audience, we also have students in the lecture today. They have to complete a learning diary about the Nexus Seminar lectures held in this semester. So you may see some related questions from them today. The questions that they must answer is, what is the three main insights of the lecture? How can your and other disciplines contribute to the topic we're hearing about today? And which other disciplines can contribute and how? Today's seminar is actually number 86, quite a lot. And I will introduce Dr. Gareth Simpson in a moment. Before we start, just some brief orientation for the participants in today's section. The speaker will start with a presentation of their work. If you have questions, you can post them in the question and answer section or the question and answer panel. And I will moderate the discussion after the presentation. We will read your questions on the panel and the speaker will answer them. And if you have any technical difficulties or questions, please do not use the Q&A, but you can use the regular chat function where you will reach Asha behind the scenes and then she can assist you with your technical difficulties. So then let's get to today's lecturer. I want to introduce to you Dr. Gareth Simpson. He is from WSP, who is the National Executive for Mine Closure in Australia. He leads a multidisciplinary team of closure planners, engineers, and project managers. He's got over 2 decades of experience in integrated engineering and environmental projects across mining, energy, and water sectors. Dr. Simpson has been at the forefront of advancing systems-based approaches to sustainability. And his PhD also focused on this, and what he is sharing with us today is related to his PhD work. It's the water, energy, food WEF, Nexus Index, and national level composite indicator based on 21 indicators. So I'm very much looking forward to this presentation, Gareth, especially also it's very nice to have a colleague from South Africa presenting today, and I would like to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serena. There we go.
Yes, we can see it.
Just moving my screens around. Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. It's lovely to meet with you for my screen. It's just not. There we go. I'm coming to you from Australia, and I think many of you will be familiar with working with Indigenous lands of Indigenous people, and it is traditional for us to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their ongoing connections to land, sea, sky, and pay our respects to elders past and present. At WSP, we have some 5,000 people that are involved in the built environment in Australia alone, but all projects are built on a place that has First Peoples history, story, unique design, and language. And as people who have influence over the built environment, we recognize our responsibility to ensure First Peoples culture and connections to country are strong and continue into the future. So my story, I'm going to give a little background to the Water, Energy, Food Nexus, or WEF Nexus. The image that you see here is a Google image of a portion of South Africa in the Mpumalanga province. This is a little town. When I was a child, my father was working at Springbok Colliery, but these are mines, open cast mines. I think you will have seen them in many jurisdictions globally. There are these kinds of scars on the country, and mining has quite an impact. And my work as a consultant working in environmental engineering was in many times to manage the separation between clean and contaminated runoff, rehabilitation of mines, and many other audits and environmental audits, etc., to ensure compliance. But as I went around and I worked on a site-to-site basis, I would see the impacts of mining, both coal mining and otherwise, such as acid mine drainage, erosion, soil contamination. And as I read the environmental management plans of many of these sites, I would see that the high potential agricultural land, which was prevalent in many parts, especially in this province, in Mpumalanga, was being lost to coal mining. And even when you rehabilitate, the land capability is significantly decreased. As I would go around sites, I would see wetland systems, such as this endorheic wetland system, that was already impacted by agriculture and other developments, but then mining would have a far more severe impact on the hydrological drivers and functioning of those wetland systems. Other wetland systems that were also impacted by agriculture, by roads, by culverts, would then be severely impacted. Globally, there are hundreds of thousands of abandoned mines where these impacts continue. And even with operational mines, many mining companies put them into care and maintenance, which means a perpetual state of skeleton staff just keeping the lights going and the security on. So this is an example of an open cast mine where we were involved in some rehabilitation, but even when rehabilitation occurs, there are significant impacts on the land capability, the water quality, and other aspects of the site. even underground mining like longwall mining. Here we see total extraction, where the mining occurred underground and then they went back and removed the pillars. There's significant impact. And you can see just above the line where it says 4.5 kilometers, there's a wetland system that goes through this area, but severely impacted landscapes. And so as I moved around these sites doing my work as a consultant, I recognized the connectedness between water, energy, and particularly fossil fuel-based energy, and agriculture. And so here in this photo taken by an ex-colleague of mine, we can see the water and wetlands. Behind that, the coal fields, then behind that, agriculture, and then a coal-fired power station. And as I sort of thought about how to solve these problems, I wondered who was talking about this. And I Googled Water, Energy, Food Conference. This was around 2015, 2016. I didn't yet know that there was such a thing as the Water, Energy, Food Nexus. And I then came upon a conference that was being organized by Future Earth at my alma mater, the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And then I attended that working group and then presented on some of the findings. But there was a phrase that Stefan Ulmbrook, who was one of the keynote speakers at that event, kept asking. And so if you think 2015, 2016, that's when the Sustainable Development Goals had just been released. And the question that kept coming up was, how do we measure the nexus? How do we measure this concept where we have cubic meters, kilowatt hours, calories, where the spatial extent varies between catchment, city, country, region. We've got temporal dimensions of days, months, and years. We've got big data. We need to integrate data. And globally, is there competency in all regions to adequately monitor these indicators? What methodologies are used? What about virtual water and other complex global issues? And even when we're talking about food, do we talk about calories or protein or obesity or malnourishment or level of access? And so this thought really got me thinking. At that conference, I presented on what I'd been thinking of and seeing on a site scale, and then I zoomed out a little bit and looked from a provincial scale. So we call our entities that make up South Africa provinces. And looking at Mpumalanga, what you're seeing in this map is the energy map that we developed then. And so the purple spaces are where mining rights are land portions where mining rights have been approved, and the red portions are where prospecting had occurred. Those little black symbols that you see there are the different, like lightnings, are the 11 power stations in Mpumalanga. So it's really, there's only 2 power stations outside of Mpumalanga, and there are other coal mining regions, but this is really the significant area. In the top right corner of this province is the world famous Kruger National Park, and it forms the boundary between South Africa and Mozambique and Swaziland. And so from this map, over 60% of the province was subject to either mining or prospecting. And so this is significant land impact and land change. Over 1,000 mines, and many of them derelict or ownerless. Historic mines where owners had declared bankruptcy or just moved on. But significantly, there are also huge socioeconomic aspects, with 90,000 jobs being provided by the coal industry. If we shift our focus and look at water in Mpumalanga, we see that it's a strategic water source area. It's water, the volume of water or the availability of water decreases as you move from east to west. And this is in the eastern side of the country. Climate change models say that there'll be a decrease. They're predicting a decrease in mean annual precipitation by up to 20% in the future. Transboundary considerations. Any water that's impacted in Mpumalanga moves, and much of it moves in an easterly direction through the Kruger Park, into Mozambique, into Swaziland. There are various other considerations. So impact on water, need to consider that. And then South Africa, with cities like Johannesburg, which are major cities being built because of gold and not because of the presence of large rivers. South Africa has complex water transfer schemes to move water within the country so that the people in the big cities can have sufficient water for their requirements. And then overall, water, South Africa is a water scarce country. We shift then in our focus to agriculture. This map shows different land capabilities, and some of the photos that I showed you of the high potential agricultural land were from this region. And only 3% of South Africa has high potential agricultural land, and remarkably, almost half of this is within this province of Mpumalanga. And so during that conference back in 2016 that I mentioned, and hearing that question, how do you measure the nexus? I was just jotting down, and then I put this little image in PowerPoint, and I started thinking, well, how would one develop some sort of composite indicator? And in my creativity came up with the WEF Nexus tri-indicator, which I just presented, and I added a slide to my presentation I was presenting on the last day of the conference, just that we had the opportunity to think about, is this a potential way? From there, I then did a short paper on Mpumalanga and the impacts as I saw them, and we then used this radar chart to start plotting what are the levels, with 0 being in the middle and 100% on the outside. To what extent? What are the shares of renewable energy? How many households have connections to mains electricity? And started thinking about key indicators. And then also started then thinking a little bit more, how are these related then to the Sustainable Development Goals? And so I'm going to put a question here onto Menti, is how best could we measure the nexus? And so I'm going to ask for some involvement as we go along. And so for those of you who are not familiar with Menti, you go onto menti.com and then you use this code and type in this code, 91556062, and then you're able to vote for different things. And I will just have a few questions during the research, during the presentation, where you'll have the opportunity to comment. I know that with this, you may want to answer more than one answer, but this is just to get our thinking going of, how best could we measure the nexus? Give a few minutes there. So we see a few people are saying integrated models. That's correct. There's some really good integrated models. Indicators are helpful. We can represent the nexus spatially, as I've demonstrated through graphs. That can be helpful. Just give you a moment to comment on there. And so we see that there are different ways, and potentially a combination of ways is the best way of doing things. We'll come back to that shortly. thank you for your participation. I do appreciate it. And so then from this point, as I was looking at the water, energy, food nexus and became aware and started reading, I looked and said, as we consider how do we measure the nexus, I zoomed out to get more of a global perspective, moving out from Mpumalanga and South Africa, and was what I was seeing on a provincial scale relevant to the global scale. And many of you will be familiar with the work of Meadows and their colleagues at MIT in 1972 in their seminal work, Limits to Growth. They wrote that if the present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet will be reached sometime within the next 100 years. And then this research group got together some 30 years later and said that the human economy is exceeding important limits now, and that this overshoot will intensify greatly over the coming decades. And so they really showed from 1970, so over 50 years ago, that this was happening. Around the time that the WEF Nexus was being put forward as a framework for representing integrated resource security and sustainable development, the World Economic Forum were also looking into this. And one of the quotes that came out of that time was that we live on a hot, hungry, crowded, and fast evaporating planet. If we focus in just on that word crowded for a moment, the population growth since the Industrial Revolution has grown, and it has really grown remarkably and exponentially. And each one of these people needs water, needs power, needs resources to live with. The demand for resources such as water, energy, food, iron ore, chrome, wood, clay have also increased exponentially. In that book, The Limits to Growth, Meadows and their colleagues showed that the amount of agricultural land needed to sustain the global population would increase as the population increased. They recognized that there's only so much arable land globally. There's a limit, as indicated by that red line. What they saw was that that demand for agricultural land, the amount of agricultural land would increase, but the amount of available land would decrease due to development of urban areas, other land uses. And so there would be this tipping point. There would be this break-even point where the yellow and the red lines intersect. And so that even if we double the present productivity, and that's present as in 1972, or quadruple that, there would still be a tipping point somewhere between the year 2000 and 2050. And what's interesting is that at the time that they wrote this report, there was some acceptance, but there were also some criticisms, because some of their work didn't necessarily have numbers or units on the axes. And so, for example, they said based on this, this carrying capacity, if you look at the top graph, either the population would stabilize at a level that the world could supply, or it would overshoot, as we see in the middle one to the left, would overshoot and then drop. In other words, there would be a large starvation event and then it would stabilize, or that it would oscillate. So the middle to the right, that one, that it would oscillate around that carrying capacity, or probably the most dire example is that there would be a mass event where people would have insufficient food and it would actually impact the world's carrying capacity. And so later on, as the numbers came out and as people saw what was happening, their work was later viewed as being prescient, and very has been referred to since then. If we turn our focus and just look at that word on a hot planet, just before we started, I was chatting to Asha and Serena, and I'm coming to you from Australia. We're already having reports that this October, in several cities will be the hottest October on record. I'm coming to you from almost midnight, and yet I have my air conditioner on. And I know that some of you are in regions where it's 0 degrees, but here, even in the evening, it's in a very high 20 degrees. In 2022, some research said that each year weather records are being broken around the globe, and this boreal summer has seen heat records fall across Europe, America, and Central Asia. These discernible effects of climate change cannot be ignored, as combined with global issues, they endanger society and well-being. And so we've seen that temperatures, Scientific America has published that temperatures even up to last year were reaching and even exceeding the 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And so, as usual, people write cartoons, sometimes satirical, but the risks are very serious. And so if we look at the word evaporating in the quote from the World Economic Forum, we see that there are many regions, with brown being the highest regions, red being also, well, being extremely high brown, and then red being high. Many areas that are going to be experiencing water stress in the coming decades. And the interconnections and interdependency of the water, energy, and food are very evident in looking at this graph. If more food is required, more water is required, and more energy is required. And the opportunities, some researchers and thinkers are focusing and saying, perhaps we should focus on reducing waste. But essentially, to use water effectively, we need to be able to move it, transport it, treat it. But there is this interconnectivity and interdependency between the elements of the nexus. There have been various quotes, one of them by Bennington in 2009, that the world would need by 2030, which doesn't seem that far away for us now. This was back in 2009, 50% more food, 50% more energy, and 30% more water. And many predictions up to 2050 are as alarming. And so in considering how we measure the nexus, this is a framework or a schematic which shows that within a context we have data. So we start on the left-hand side. From this we can derive indicators, and we can choose to develop indices or an index. And from that information, we can also undertake qualitative studies, like you mentioned, quantitative studies using models, GIS, and essentially to gain knowledge to inform decision-making and policy-making. And so in doing this, as we continued with our research, we started partnering with different researchers and practitioners specializing in composite indicators and data visualization. And so in my research, I then came across the Competence Center, a joint research center from the European Union in Ispra in Italy, Competence Center on Composite Indicators and Scoreboards. And they present training which I attended and really follow a 10-step process to how to develop a composite indicator. And so as I looked at all these global impacts and looked at data on a local level, I started then to try and think, well, how do we measure it on a national level? How do we move? And so we need to define the concepts, preferably with some form of framework to help guide the selection of indicators. We need to analyze and treat the data. We need to bring all the indicators to a common scale. These indicators can vary by orders of magnitude, and we need them at a common scale. We need to weigh the indicators and dimensions in a way that's reflective of the framework, aggregate them, and then assess their statistical and conceptual coherence, look at the impact of uncertainties, make sense of the data? Is that which we're developing, does it make sense? Is it adequately representing and providing insight into what we need to answer, where we need to guide policy, where we need to make decisions? And then lastly, to visualize the data. And so a guiding principle which rang throughout that training and throughout their literature is that composite indicators and scoreboards should be developed sensibly and used responsibly. And so before selecting indicators, it is necessary to develop a guiding framework. That was the first step. And in their guidelines, they say that approximately 2/3 of your time should be spent in developing the framework and selecting your indicators, i.e. those first two steps. And so the selection of indicators and the construction of the composite index will be guided by the framework, and what lies at its center will ultimately provide an outcomes-based perspective. And so I'm wanting us to go and wanting to ask another question. And we're going to move to the next question. Let me see if I can go there. And if you could go back to your Menti, I should have asked you to keep it open, but if you could, please keep it open during the presentation. And in developing a framework, what do you think should be at the center of the Nexus? Should it be land? Should it be water? Should it be energy? Should it be food, ecosystems? What is at the core of the Nexus? Great, thank you again for all your participation. Really great to see your insights and your thoughts. And we see that within these graphs, there's a relatively equal balance, and potentially with livelihoods getting some more votes. So thank you for that. So if we go back to the questions here, what lies at the center? This was a really core question for us, and in developing the framework that came out of our research, we then said that humanity, livelihoods, equitable access for us, and particularly coming from developing or global south perspective, lay at the center. Many of the early frameworks had water at the center, in the sense that, and water is essential. But what we were saying, and we termed this the anthropocentric WEF Nexus framework, and basically saying that it is anthropocentric since humanity receives water, food, and energy either in a sustainable or an unsustainable manner, and humanity impacts the environment from which these resources are obtained. Humanity is also the player and the referee, since we govern, we set policies, and we uphold the rule of law, such as statutory duty of care. And so humanity is within this entire framework, but essentially what we're looking at is equitable access, supporting livelihoods, making the world a more equal and fairer place. And that then guided us in our selection of indicators. Another way to look at this framework was, and coming from the late 90s, I was quite involved with integrated water resource management, which was also a sustainability framework, but was more water-centric. The critical thing which we tried to uphold within this index was that it would be multi-centric and have water, energy, and food treated equally. We were involved in a lot of stakeholder engagement at various levels with people from the public, the academia, private sector, government sector, both in South Africa, with people from other parts of Africa, and then at several opportunities in Europe. It's really interesting that we got to this point where we said access and availability are the key sub-pillars. And in subsequent work that I've been involved in, such as the Nexus Genesis, where we've brought ecosystems in, it makes this system far more complex because ecosystems are in a different category. They cannot be grouped into subcategories of access and availability. Ecosystems, they're not a resource that can be consumed or accessed in the way that the other three can. And so moving on from this, again, looking at the rules of thumb from the Center of Composite Indicators and Scoreboards, their rules of thumb are that there should be between 15 and 40 indicators to make up a composite indicators. There are some excellent composite indicators that are only made up of 4. The most well-known, I think, within this forum would be the HDI, or Human Development Index. But there are other composite indicators that have some 220 indicators. And then to make sure that there's sufficient data at an indicator level, at least 65% of the countries should have valid data for that indicator. And then at a country level, each country should have at least 65% of the indicators. And so in evaluating all the countries globally, quite often it's the small island states that fall out, that don't have sufficient information to participate and be evaluated in these assessments because of the shortage of data. And then also plot the data, use graphs, histograms, check for outliers, try to understand what the data looks like. And so then in the indicators, we searched databases, left, right, and center, evaluated and looked at them. What we did in our research then was and if we move from left to right in these columns for every indicator, we shortlisted 80 sector do they fall into, water, energy, or food, what their name is, what their definition is, what the source of the data is, when the data was accessed, what is the data availability like, is it an SDG indicator? Because if it is an SDG indicator, there's a good chance that its monitoring would be continued. And then did we include this indicator in the index or not, and give a motivation, yes or no, why? And we published this as supplementary information. And then, as I mentioned, the stakeholder engagement was a critical aspect of selecting and finalizing the 21 indicators that we then settled on. This image shows the 21 indicators spread across the 3 pillars and 6 sub-pillars. We then subsequently had to weight these, and we can see that we sought to treat the pillars 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So we had a multi-centric framework, and then we also treated the sub-pillars equally. And we then sought to visualize the data, and then some of you may have used this tool. And so I'm just going to take you to this for a moment. We then sought to make a tool that could be used to visualize the data. And so we house that on the wefnexusindex.org. And really what we then enable through this tool, through this index calculation, you can see it's been updated 5 times, 2019 up to 2023. What it enables you to do is search for a country that we're looking for. And so we could go and look at Germany, and we can then get an indication of what is the Water, Energy, Food Nexus Index, what do the pillars look like, the sub-pillars, and then we can look at how is the data distributed in terms of access and availability for water, energy, and food, and where that country ranks for each of these sub-pillars. And then we go through and provide the index values. What we've really viewed the index is that it's an entry point into the hierarchical data set. We go back to the home page. There are various opportunities to evaluate water, energy, food, and then we can start interrogating and seeing where do countries rank. Where do they rank for water, energy, or food? And we can look at different years. We can then say, all right, we want our focus to be an area such as the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. And we can focus in our attention there, and we can view it in different ways so that we can analyze the data and see how it presents. We can look at trends and see how has it changed over time. And again, we could focus in on sub-Saharan Africa and say, you know, how are these countries performing, and what is the trend been? What is the trajectory of these countries? We can look at correlations, and so we can choose different variables here. And what we will look at, and this is the water, energy, food nexus for the HDI, and we can fit a trend line and see what it is, what the regression analysis is, what the degree of correlation is. We can provide a logarithmic scale, and for different years. We can also change, and the size of these blocks are related to population or Gini coefficient or different parameters that are evaluated. And we can filter which countries we want to look at. And so we developed this tool. It also allows for clusters where up to 4 countries can be evaluated, and we can see what they look like in terms of how they're evaluated and what the different pillar values are, and then look at human development or GDP per capita and get an indication of how these are plotting. Really just tools for policymakers, decision makers, researchers to make, and then we've sought to just provide some feedback on when there are updates to the calculation methodology, when new indicator data comes out, and then provide it as a Creative Commons license, so people are free to share as long as they do it in the right way, and then clearly set out a methodology with the relevant papers. And so we've subsequently been involved in various training, and perhaps for your students, this might be an interesting exercise. But what we would normally do is divide our students up into groups, and we'd ask them to select a country. It's very advantageous if people from a particular country or from a neighbor of that country participate in that group, so that there is a knowledge of that country. And what they then do within this group, whether it's online in breakout groups or in person around tables, they evaluate the index values for the various years, analyze the trends in terms of index value and rank using the menus I showed, to analyze the performance within a region. So look at the region and say, are there outliers? How is this trending? To look at different parameters and how does the Water Energy Food Nexus Index for this country relate to these? Are there any interesting, and we'll touch on this for a few countries, observations that we can make based on that. We can look at a comparison nation. So if we were looking, for example, at Zambia, we might say we want a comparison with Zimbabwe, which is a close neighbor. We would then get them to evaluate the pillars, sub-pillars, and indicator values for the various years, and then to consider, and there is limited time, but as part of their homework, to then look at what other tools, indicators, literature, whether grey or academic, policies have relevance to this nation, to then do a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, potential trade-offs. How do these compare with the comparison nation? And really using this index as an entry point, as a point of departure to go into and explore, and then to consider what are the global challenges related to climate, socioeconomics in that country, SDG achievement, etc. I mentioned the Human Development Index, which is was developed in 1990 and administered and maintained by the United Nations. What we found when we plotted the Human Development Index against the Water Energy Food Nexus is that there was a moderate degree of correlation, but really it provides an opportunity, and this is where our next question, so if you have your mentees open there, if you look at this graph, which country would you choose to provide key policy insights related to integrated resource management? So have a look at this, and we'll go back to this graph once you've had an opportunity. I'll leave this on the screen. I won't move from the screen. Perhaps you can have Menti open on one screen and this on another one. If you had to look at countries, which country would you choose to provide key policy insights related to integrated resource management?
Gareth, do you want us to put something
Yes.
in mentees? On my side,
Yeah.
I just see an hourglass. I don't know about the others.
Ah, yes, that's my mistake. Thank you. Thanks, Serena. There we
Yes,
go.
now
That
it's
should be
changed.
better.
Thank you.
Sorry, that's my error completely. I will just, on my screen, I'll go back for a minute here so that you can see this graph. I see one answer is Brazil. Thank you for prompting me. Not very good at multitasking, it seems. So we have some countries, Norway, which scores very high on the Human Development Index. Australia. Norway also has a very high Water Energy Food Nexus Index. I'll just go back here for those of you who might want a few more minutes. Hong Kong, China, India, India's here in the middle. Let's leave it another 10 seconds. All right, I'm going to go back. Thank you for everybody who's participated in that. What's interesting and what I think stood out for us as we looked at this research, and I think, you know, you're each providing great examples, and there are lessons that can be learned from many different nations, Australia and Norway, up at the top here. You know, Brazil has got huge water resources. But then when we're looking at, you know, key insights for integrated resource management, where our eyes, and someone mentioned Hong Kong and Singapore, what's interesting about some of these nations is that they have relatively high human development index values, but they have relatively low water, energy, food nexus index values. And so the question then needs to be asked is, how are Hong Kong and Singapore and Qatar and Barbados and Botswana and some of these countries, how are they achieving with, relatively speaking, lower integrated water, energy, food nexus security? How are they achieving these high levels of human development index, where the country is prospering at a higher level? And the one example that that stood out was Singapore, and it's really interesting, and it's a development case study often. Singapore is a resource poor nation. They have a mean annual rainfall of 2.5 meters, which is massive, but the renewable internal freshwater resources are only 110 cubic meters per capita, which is half of the 10th percentile of the countries appraised. And so you can see they've got quite a lot of water, but their food pillar is very low. The average value of food production is $5 international, which is the lowest of any of the 170 countries evaluated. And so a high HDI ranking and relatively low WEF Nexus index value indicate that Singapore is very dependent on other nations for obtaining food. And how does a country like Singapore, as an example, what sort of policies are they putting in place? And this is where I think what's helpful is that it demonstrates the complexity. The Human Development Index provides one lens. The Water, Energy, Food Nexus Index provides another lens. But then there are other things which some of these countries are doing. And Lee Kuan Yew, who led the country for several decades, in his book From Third World to First World, which was their transformation, he said that talent is the country's most precious asset. For a small resource-poor country like Singapore with 2 million people at independence in 1965, it is the defining factor. And so they, in the absence of resources, land and plentiful water, they invested in people. Subsequent research has said Singapore compensated for the absence of natural resources by investing heavily in education to enhance the skills of its population. And so on other indices like Transparency International's index for combating corruption, or the Global Competitive Index, Singapore always ranks really highly in those things. And so it's a very interesting case study. In a further work that we did, trying to apply the Water, Energy, Food Nexus Index and demonstrate it as a case study, we looked at Africa. And there again, we plotted the HDI versus the WEF Nexus Index. There's a lower degree of correlation. But what we sought to do then was focus in on various countries and say, what are those countries like Botswana, who has a relatively high human development index, but a relatively low water, energy, food nexus index, and then the other way around. And so we looked at countries like Gabon in our analysis there, and Gabon has the third highest WEF Nexus Index value and has a relatively high human development at 0.7. And in this work that we did in analyzing African nations, one of the things that we came across with several African nations, and Gabon is a really good example, is that the annual freshwater withdrawals in this nation constitute 0.085% of the internal resources. And so that indicates that this country has significant internal freshwater resources, but they are not being harnessed or exploited for industry or agriculture. And this prompted the thinking as we were going through the data and analyzing it, that energy is a key enabler for water use, in pumping the water, in moving the water, in treating the water. And I'll return to that in coming slides. We then looked at Chad and Sudan and Eritrea. These countries had low, both low water energy food nexus indices and human development index. Two of these countries are landlocked, which provides a development challenge. These three African countries rank as the three lowest nations in terms of the global human development index. In these countries, the WEF Nexus Index provides an insight as to the effect that poor access to and availability of the critical livelihood resources of water, energy, and food. They have critical impacts on development. Not all nations have this causation, but it seems to hint towards this. We also looked at Namibia and Botswana that, have a lower, relatively low water energy food nexus, but relatively high HDR. And so they fall into the similar category of Hong Kong and Singapore. What policies are they putting in place? These countries that rank 171st and 169th in the global WEF Nexus Index, but they have relatively high education and literacy values. Niger is another example. Niger could potentially enhance its use of natural resources for the benefits of its population. However, again, this is a landlocked country, which poses a challenge. Also, this country only has 151 millimeters per year, and this can be contrasted with other countries like the DRC, Congo, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, all of which receive, sort of 1.5 meters of water annually, 10 times the amount of Niger. And so that age-old adage that where you are born and where you grow up on the globe has a severe impact on your opportunities in life rings true as we move around with these different analyses. And notwithstanding the low rainfall, Niger attains a relatively high level of food production compared to other African countries. And so many of these nations, even if they're not the most high-ranking nations, have it's worth analyzing what policies do they in place, how are they doing certain things that they can punch above their weight with certain criteria, and what can they learn about from others in terms of enhancing the ones where they need to grow. The term of differential diagnosis, Jeffrey Sachs, in his book, The Age of Sustainable Development, uses this. His wife is a doctor, and in analyzing someone would do a differential diagnosis, analyzing them medically. And in his book, he proposes that we do these in development, that we do these differential diagnoses, that we look and analyze, is this holding true, is that holding true, what can we look at here, and to try and analyze these nations in this way by looking at different variables, different criteria. And so the WEF Nexus Index serves as an entry point into the hierarchical data set and serves as a catalyst for developmental differential diagnoses. And as mentioned earlier, an analysis of the energy subpillars for the African nations in the study indicated that there's a limitation to enhancing agriculture in most of these countries due to a lack of access to energy. I will add a caveat in a short while just related to that. This is supported by the moderate correlation between the Human Development Index and the energy access subpillar. There's also the similar correlation between the HDI and the water, saying that human development is proportional to energy access and water access, which is intuitively makes sense. And this assessment that energy is potentially in several African countries is a limiting factor, and perhaps is a real area of focus in agriculture, contrasts with the widely held perception that water is the principal limiting factor. And so at a macro level, it could be concluded that African countries should invest heavily in large-scale water storage and energy supply infrastructure. However, a detailed analysis provides the more nuanced message, which indicates that smallholder agriculture systems, which dominate areas such as sub-Saharan Africa, may require more balanced solutions, such as local storage or small-scale energy production. And so the identification of adjacent realities, which can be missed when only looking at global indicators, needs to be considered. So energy is a vital enabler of economic activity in general, but agriculture in particular. Let me see. Sorry, I skipped one question there. So I'm going to move to the Menti again and say, what are the best mechanisms to enhance energy production in Africa, such that it can act as an enabler for water and food security? Let me not make the same mistake as last time. And so if you could go back to your Menti. This is a free text option. Great. First comment there, renewable energy like solar and microgrids. Healthy competition within the private sector, great point. Stable policy environment, definitely. Upscaling of hydropower usage. Definitely, there are some nations and immediately countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo come to mind. Massive potential. Sometimes political hurdles are massive. Clean energy for sustainable water and food production. Agree with that. Very, very similar to the first comment, but very helpful. Cross-sectoral policy coherence. Correct. We can learn lessons from other regions, such as regions where energy was just provided at a massive scale and at a very low cost and involved, and then later on threatened water security itself due to huge amounts of pumping, collaboration and partnerships. That's great. You can continue if you have any other thoughts, go back there. In the interest of time, understanding the financial support for energy investment by private sectors. Great comments. Thank you, everybody. And so, as we've done this research, and the index is at a national level, which has some strengths, but it does have some weaknesses. But what's happened in the years subsequent to developing the Water Energy Food Nexus, various researchers globally have used the methodology and the data and applied it to different regions. So some researchers looked at northern Canada, others at Iraq, some looked at Bulgaria, Mediterranean, Alaska, and the Horn of Africa. And these are just some examples of how this was then applied, and we'll reach, this is just a selection of those studies, but it does prompt the need, because I've been approached by various UN bodies to say, well, can we develop a tool for developing sub-national indicators? And to date, I just haven't the time or headspace to really develop that. And so really, where to from here? That's part of the reason for me being really excited to discuss this topic, is just to share a little of where we've come from with the Water Energy Food Nexus Index, how it's been developed, how it's been applied, and then looking at where is it going to go into the future, and how are we going to carry. And yeah, I'm personally looking forward to working with a number of you in the coming years, and part of this work will be related to this, part of it related to post-mining transitions, which is more of my day job. But really saying, we see real opportunities. This index has been tested, and there's a real opportunity to do studies together with local researchers from the MENA region, or Southeast Asia, or South America, with policymakers, with resource entities like the water bodies or the energy departments, and really try to provide in that similar manner to which we looked at, that we do the training for the winter school and the virtual masterclass, that there are really opportunities to do regional studies, and to use the index as an entry point into that data, and then to really try and look at analyzing how countries are performing, how integrated resource management is happening, how people are measuring the nexus, how they're managing the nexus, learning from one another. The other opportunity which we have, which I mentioned just a short while ago, is to develop a national index tool, potentially a page on the website where different researchers or decision makers can enter data and have the calculation of the tool in a standardized manner. And then really a key question is, where is the home for the Water Energy Food Nexus Index? Where should this index fall under and be part of a team that can work on the annual index updates, studies, have PhDs and master students furthering the work, having focus areas, looking at policy development opportunities, and adding resource centers or labs to the WEF Nexus Index.org website. And so, currently this research has been led by myself with some research partners, including my PhD supervisor. But it's reaching the point now where we have the data for 2024 and about to capture the data for 2025. But the funding that we received from the Dutch government, which served as a sort of part-time postdoc, has ended. And it's really saying, what is the future for this index? And so we're going to close off with just 3 questions. And the first question is, where is the best home for the Water Energy Food Nexus Index within UNU, UN, or academic structures? And I will just go through and just tap the page there. And so if you'd like to comment on that. Academia? Thanks for that comment. I like that idea. Dedicated UN-affiliated centers on resource management. Love to explore that a little bit more. Research proposals at UNU that include further development of the index. Agreed. Research. We definitely want to continue it. Academia research over the WEF operationalization lies within the industry, with industries. Thank you for that. Academia research and collaboration. Thank you. Just go to the second last question. How does the WEF Nexus Index intersect with your discipline? And many of us have different entry points, equity, human rights, biodiversity, sustainable development goals, migration, agriculture, globalization. Data science, data quality, visualization, correct?
I see there's a comment in the chat, green finance. That's interesting.
That's interesting. It's very interesting. I think that's super interesting, the life cycle assessment. Biodiversity, agreed. And as I mentioned earlier, the moment you add biodiversity in, the complexity just goes up significantly. By measuring how resource recovery and e-waste, urban mining affects pollution across resources. Fantastic. Migration, especially within the context of countries in the Sahel region, herders and farmers clashes lead to trade-offs between the three resources. So that's really so sad and tough. That's so true and so practical. You know, how can we solve those? How can we contribute to solving those? Sustainable and renewable energy. Theory building. Great. Yeah, there's real opportunities to supplement and use different systems. And so working with colleagues at IHE Delft, they do a lot of causal loop diagrams and development of machine learning models that are far more complex than my work. Land use and land cover dynamics. It's very relevant. Thank you so much for your input on this. And then the last question is, how would you like to become involved in the WEF Nexus Index? This is a rogue M there. And if you'd like to become involved in the work, please let me know. I think going forward, I'd really like to become involved with some UNU, as suggested in one of the decisions, some research proposals together, working together in this.
People still typing. I cannot see. We had one
Sure.
question. Just
Yes.
you said this was your last slide, livelihoods.
Correct. This is the end. Yes.
But I think Daniel had a comment about Singapore, but I think he had to leave, so he's not here anymore.
Oh.
And I don't see any other questions. Maybe while we're waiting for this, just one question, because this is also about multidisciplinary sustainability. You mentioned interdisciplinary teams, transdisciplinary work on this, and I know you're an engineer. What other disciplines did you come across or supported this, or do you think are relevant to solving or addressing this issue?
Yeah, so I work just in my day-to-day work, we work with ecologists, contaminated land specialists, surface water specialists, geohydrologists, tailings engineers, regulatory specialists, social performance, in other words, stakeholder engagement, cultural heritage. So there's landform design. So that's in my day-to-day work, where the WEF Nexus Index is applied within a mining context, and mine rehabilitation and closure context. Within this, within the WEF Nexus Index, what I've found with the forums that I've been involved in is generally the bulk of the people that are interested in the Water Energy Food Nexus Index. It's normally sort of 50, 60%, maybe 70% come from a water background. So it's often water heavy. We need more representation from particularly the energy sector. And so there's a risk that even WEF Nexus Index, but really, we've worked with policy specialists, people who specialize in soil science, and there's a lot of different entry points into this.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and also your data showed a bit that the energy is the important thing that's not being considered when the resources need to be managed in an integrated manner.
Yeah, and so the work that we've done with Graham, and then you may know Tafadzwa Mabadi as well. He does a lot of work on the ground, with people, and he says the narrative is just that water is the limiting factor to agriculture. That's the overriding narrative, and so when we were working on this, he was like, wow, it's not. And we've got data that shows that if you've got energy to do something with that water, to move it, you can do so much. The water's often there, and again, I'm not being naive. There are countries where there's real water shortage in Africa, and that's not the case. But there are many nations where there are opportunities to really harness that resource.
Okay, and so with that, I would like to thank you, Gareth, for taking the time to give us a glimpse into your work today. It was really interesting, really fascinating. I have many more questions, but I think we're running out of time. I would also like to thank the participants for interactively engaging, and thanks also for Gareth for doing the Mentimeter. I think that's also always a very nice way of not only listening, but then engaging and thinking about how this content applies to yourself. And I would like to invite everybody to our next Nexus Seminar lecture, which will be on the 17th of November, same time as today. We will still announce the speaker via LinkedIn, but we are looking forward to that. So with that, thank you again and all the best, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.